And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good day. Back with what's probably not going to be a very long stream. Partly it's to test out my internet because I actually moved house at the end of last week, and I am still trying to sort my internet out, and I need to make sure that I can stream. So we're going to be doing that partly. And as I usually do, we're going to play a little tune before we start. Where are we? And there we go, land of hope and glory. Okay, so what this stream really is to talk about some great British people. I know that Adaman has got a couple of guys who are not so well known. I'm going to start us off with what I think should be probably the first famous Englishman, and that would be Alfred the Great, who pretty much was instrumental in stopping the UK being taken over by the Danes, or the Vikings as they are more commonly, if erroneously called, by managing to keep Wessex going. And eventually, under his son, his dream was realized and England was united into one country.
Yeah, he was sort of the one that started it all, wasn't he? Sort of brought in the sort of founding image that we might recognise today.
As England, an Englishman, yes, I agree totally. He doesn't get enough. He doesn't usually get enough kudos for that, because it was really his dream that made England a united country. So yeah, I think we can put him down as probably one of the first great Englishmen. If we're going to look at royals, I'd probably include Edward III. Harold also, because Harold, people often forget that Harold, who was defeated at Hastings in 1066 by William the Bastard, Harold had already defeated a big Danish army up north, and then he had to rush back down south to face William the Bastard's forces. So Harold is another guy who I think we could include as a great Englishman. But then if we're going to, as I say, look at royals, Edward III, probably my favourite, Henry V. I think you've also got to look Henry VIII, probably. Certainly Elizabeth I, great English woman. So I don't know, Adam, any particular monarchs, etc., that you admire?
I'm not sure. What do you think about Edward Longshanks?
Yeah, that's Edward III, isn't it?
Yeah, but he had a bit of a spotty reputation, though, didn't he? Because didn't he have to force people to come to his meetings because people just weren't interested otherwise?
That could be, but he was certainly a great military commander.
Yeah.
And Hammer of the Scots, which is not so good from the British point of view. But then, of course, on the Scottish side, you've got people like Robert Bruce, for example. And also, I suppose, the guy who bloody what's his name, Mel Gibson played in that awful bloody movie.
Oh, I can't remember that guy's name.
Yeah, I bloody well know him, because there used to be a huge monument to him at Stirling Bridge.
Yeah,
but
I've forgotten who he is.
Yeah, me too. It's completely gone out of my head. I can just picture Mel Gibson going "for freedom," which was absolute bullshit.
William Wallace.
William Wallace is the guy, yes, of course. But yeah, so I mean, you got some great Scotsmen on that side in the early days as well. But yeah, what any other monarchs that you would pick out?
What about Henry VII?
Yeah, I suppose.
I mean, he did all right. He's kind of a bit he's kind of a bit overlooked nowadays, but
absolutely. I mean, another guy, he wasn't a monarch, but he would have been if he hadn't have died, was of course the Black Prince, another brilliant soldier as well. I remember my father took me to Canterbury Cathedral when I was probably about 7 or 8 or something like that, and the one thing I always remembered from it was looking at the Black Prince's armor. There's some of his armor over his tomb, or at least they used to be when I went there. They may have moved it by now, but they had his sword and helmet and one or two other things, I believe, just over his tomb. And the Black Prince, of course, was another great soldier. One of the great victories in the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, I've seen that grave a few times. I grew up in Canterbury, but
oh, cool.
Who was the guy who took over shortly after he died? The son. He wasn't around for very long.
Oh, bloody hell. I could probably look it up,
Richard
I suppose.
II.
Yeah, sounds about right. Yep. Yeah, I think you're right.
Right, yeah.
Is there another one you like?
He's all right. He was quite young though.
Hmm.
But he had to put up with a lot of shit. He had like the peasants' revolt and stuff like that at the time.
He did. And then I think he was that guy. He actually got older, didn't he? Like he started off quite good, and then as he got older, became more and more paranoid and what have you.
Yeah, because I think Shakespeare's rendition of him is quite harsh.
Yeah.
Probably quite accurate. So.
One of the ones I really like is Henry V, partly because Henry V was the first English king since Harold who spoke English as his first language. And the reason for that, of course, was that his father, although his father was an aristocrat and related to the royal family, he actually wasn't royal. And the English aristocracy, even in the 1300s, were learning English first and then French second. Whereas the royal family themselves, up until then, used to learn French first and then English. So Henry V was actually the first monarch who spoke English as his first language. So that's another reason I like Henry V. I mean, apart from, of course, the brilliant victory at Agincourt.
Yeah. How long was Henry V in for?
He wasn't king for that long because he got ill and died. People think it might have been dysentery or something like that.
Yeah.
So he died quite young, and he was on the point of actually taking over most of France when he did die, because he was just such an exceptional soldier.
Mm.
And he understood the longbow very well because he'd been shot by one. He was actually shot in the face by a longbow in another campaign. While he had his visor of his helmet lifted up, someone shot him in the face, and it was only because obviously he was the king's son that he got like the very best medical care you could get in that time, and they managed to get the damn thing out. But he was lucky to survive. And so he understood the power of the longbow and used it extremely well himself. So yeah, I think we can certainly put Henry V. I actually like Queen Victoria as well. I think there's a lot of nonsense spoken about her. People say she had a German accent. And I remember listening to a very old lady in the 1970s being interviewed who remembered Queen Victoria. And she said she didn't have a German accent. It was nonsense. It's just something that people say. And there's no reason why she would have had a German accent, actually. She didn't really spend much time in Germany, even though she was married to a German prince.
Yeah, I think people tried to sort of malalign everything from that period, including the Queen herself. So they kind of, I mean, they tried to even have the very word Victorian. They tried to make as if it should be perceived in poor taste.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet you look at, I mean, I like, one of the things I like about Melbourne, which I've just moved out of, is it's got beautiful Victorian 19th century buildings. Far more than Sydney, for example. And that's one of the best things about Melbourne. And, you know, you get people say, oh, yeah, poor taste, as you rightly say, Ashman. But I mean, if you look at Victorian buildings, the nicest buildings are far superior to the glass and concrete crap that we build today. You know?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. Now, you were telling me about this extraordinary chap just before we came on air, who I had not heard of, but he was certainly interesting. So maybe you'd like to tell the listeners about this chap a bit.
Yeah. So this guy, Ewan Cameron Bruce, he joined the British Army at during the height of World War One, and he was originally in the machine gun corps, and he was an officer. And at that time, the tank corps were just starting to be formed, and he sort of immediately volunteered for it. But he was originally like a troop commander, so his job was his team would go out, and they would have artillery and machine gun fire rained on them as they would try to recover sort of tanks that needed to be repaired.
Uh-huh.
And he won several military crosses and all this other stuff. He also lost his left arm. And despite that, he carried on, but he became a tank commander after that, and he got gassed and wounded several more times. And after that, he signed up for the British Expeditionary Force to go and assist the White Army in the Russian Civil War. And they were only supposed to be there to help train the White Army troops. And they were trying to take Tsaritsyn, which is now Stalingrad.
Mm-hmm.
And well, it's not. I think it's now Volgograd. But it's the city most people would know as Stalingrad. And the Whites have been trying to take it for days, and they kept getting repelled. The Bolshevik force there was massive. And this was under Peter Wrangel, who was probably the most famous White Army general. There's actually a memoir of him that's just been released called Always with Honor that people can get. That's apparently quite good, but I haven't got around to reading it myself. And so they went out and did a recce of the city in a plane, and Ewan and Cameron Bruce sort of spotted a Bolshevik observational balloon, and they shot it down. And he went to Peter Wrangel and said, "Can I lead the third assault on the city?" And he agreed. And they moved up and took like a forward defensive position, and they captured this bit of ground. And on the first day, and they said, "Oh, we'll move on the city in the second day, but we got to wait for fuel to arrive." And they only got enough fuel and ammunition, with pooling all the rest of their fuel from all the other Mark V tanks. They could just about arm and fuel one tank. So he said, "Right, well, I'll take it then. We'll take my tank." And they rolled up on the city. And because most Bolsheviks had never even seen a tank, like a lot of them just surrendered. I think they captured about like 40,000 people there. And they basically took the entire city over the span of about 2 days.
So much for the Nazi blitzkrieg in World War II. One tank.
It was pretty amazing, and I think there was a guy. There was a tank corps guy more recently who wrote a book on the history of the British tank corps, and he reckoned it was one of the most heroic feats that had ever been pulled off in the history of that unit.
Yeah, there was. I mean, one of the things that I know you know about, because you talked about it to me, is there were so many extraordinary soldiers in the British and Commonwealth forces in World War One that people mostly don't know about anymore.
Yeah, there's so many untold stories out there. It's just trying to find them, and put them together.
Yeah, I've always found it interesting. It's kind of like when I was a kid, and I've always been interested in military history, because my family were all army. So, but when I was a kid, it was easy to find books about World War II. It's much more difficult to find books about World War One.
Yeah,
it's never been quite as popular. It's and you have to kind of know what you're looking for in a way to find stuff about World War One, whereas there's memoirs of World War II all over the place, and from the British point of view, or the British Commonwealth point of view, the fighting in World War One was actually that's not true. It was more intense for longer for British and Commonwealth troops in World War One than it was in World War II, where there were half a dozen divisions engaged against the Afrika Korps in North Africa, and of course there were troops in the Far East, and then there were a lot of troops involved in Normandy and all that kind of stuff, and also the reconquest of Burma at the end of the war in the Far East. But for quite a lot of the war, a large portion of the British Army was actually in UK training, whereas in World War One they were actually fighting the main body of the German army for most of the war, which is, of course, why the casualties were so enormous, really.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things with World War II, isn't it? We all think about it starting in 1939, but outside of raids and the Air Force, nothing really happened for quite a while.
Well, apart from the guys in North Africa, of course, and obviously from the end of 1941 onwards, the guys in the Far East were quite heavily engaged with the Japanese. Like the Australians in World War II were the first guys to beat the Germans on land because they managed to defeat Rommel's attempts to capture Tobruk in the Western Desert. And some of the same guys later on were the first Allied troops to beat the Japanese on land in New Guinea. So the Australians did really, really well in World War II from that point of view.
Yeah. I mean, probably a bit of a more unpopular opinion, but I often think that the North Africa campaign was the real turning point in that war.
Well, yeah, I suppose it was in a way. I mean, it was in the West, certainly.
Yeah, it absorbed a lot of German armor, a lot of resources.
It did, but also, of course, it meant that the Mediterranean was open after the defeat of the Axis forces in North Africa, because obviously most of them were Italian, not German. But after the defeat of the Axis forces in the Mediterranean, it did open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping again. And then, of course, Sicily and Italy got invaded and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, in a way, it was a turning point, I suppose. But World War II was really decided on the Eastern Front, to be honest with you. I mean, that was where the main body of the German army was and where they were defeated. So it was more the Eastern Front than North Africa. But I sometimes... All right, we're going to talk about great British people. General O'Connor. General O'Connor was an excellent British commander in the early part of World War II.
This is the guy that did Operation Compass, isn't it?
Yes.
Right.
And he had about 38,000 troops. They were mostly British, but there were also some Australians and some Indian soldiers. And with those 38,000 troops, he destroyed two Italian armies with 200,000 men. Totally destroyed them, captured, killed, wounded, and all the rest of it. And he was on the point of actually completely clearing the Italians out of North Africa when Churchill took a lot of his troops away and sent them to Greece. And it's never made any sense to me because British intelligence knew that something like 20 odd German divisions were going to invade Greece. And they sent there one New Zealand division, one Australian division, and a British armoured brigade. Now, 2.5 Commonwealth divisions, even were they the best troops in the world, were never going to beat 12 or 15 or 14 or 20 German divisions. It just is absolutely impossible. So I never have understood how that was a good plan. And of course, had O'Connor been allowed to clean up the whole of North Africa, there would have been no North African campaign for the best part of 3 years.
Yeah.
So to me, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, definitely General Richard O'Connor, another great Brit as far as I'm concerned. He was actually eventually captured by the Germans. He then escaped from the Italians, and he was I think he was I'm not sure. He was a corps commander in the Normandy campaign in 1944 because he managed to escape from the Italians by that time. So yeah, definitely another great Brit. I think you've also got. I mean, okay, let's look at soldiers for a minute. To my mind, greatest British generals, I'd probably say Wellington, obviously enough, because he really didn't lose a battle as far as I can work out. He lost a skirmish or two in India when he was a very young and inexperienced chap. But when he was actually in charge, he never lost a battle. He never lost a siege. Used to pick his ground beautifully, and people will say, "Oh yeah, he was a defensive commander." That's not really true. Look at battles like Salamanca, for example, in the Peninsular War, where he took the offensive and absolutely trashed a French army. Yeah, Wellington probably be my number one British soldier. Number two would have to be Marlborough, I think. Yeah, definitely Duke of Marlborough, Churchill's famous ancestor, who Churchill always wished he was and certainly wasn't, because he was not a great commander, sadly. But Yeah, so Marlborough would be my number 2. After that, there are a lot of good British commanders. So Harry Smith is one people don't know very well. He went off to the Peninsular War as a teenager, as a ensign in the army, which was the lowest form of life in the British Army of those days, as an officer. And as he left, his father said to him, "Remember, you're an Englishman," and it's the title of his biography, or his best-known biography. And Harry Smith fought in most of the battles in the Peninsular War. He was then sent to America because the Americans had started the War of 1812, thinking because Britain was fighting a life or death struggle with Napoleon, that they could easily invade Canada and take Canada over as well. And of course, they came completely unstuck because the Canadians didn't actually want to be Americans, partly because lots of the loyalist Americans had moved to Canada after the War of Independence. So they got quite a bloody nose, and about 3 American invasions of Canada were defeated. So Harry Smith was one of the reinforcements that was sent there towards in 1814, I think it was, when the first time Napoleon abdicated and when he was sent to Elba. So he went across there, and he was part of the British forces that captured Washington, D.C. They fought a battle against the Americans, which the Brits called the Bladensburg Races. It was a place called Bladensburg, which is outside Washington. And it was called the Bladensburg Races because it was a race to see how quickly the Americans could run away and the British could advance. And so the British actually captured Washington, D.C. They burnt the White House. They didn't touch any of the private buildings there. They only destroyed government buildings. And they did that in retaliation for for the Americans burning York in Canada, which I think is now Toronto. But in those days it was called York, and the Americans had burnt all the public buildings there when they captured it. So in retaliation, we burnt the public buildings in Washington. So Harry Smith ended up pinching some of President Madison's shirts because he didn't have any clean shirts. So he pinched a couple of Madison's shirts that he'd left there when he ran away. And then he went back to Europe and fought against Napoleon again. Then he fought in South Africa against Xhosa, and actually also fought against a rebellion of the Afrikaners, the Boers in the Cape, and defeated them, which as time went on became a bigger and bigger deal because it wasn't too easy to defeat the Boers in South Africa, but Sir Harry Smith managed it at a battle called Boomplatz in the 1840s. And then he was sent to India, and he took part in the Anglo-Sikh Wars. Now, the Sikhs had their troops were all European trained. They were trained mostly by French, Italian, and American officers. They were equipped like the Europeans. In fact, the Sikh infantry even wore red coats in imitation of the Brits. And the Sikh artillery had more guns and heavier guns than the British did. And so the British fought 2 Anglo-Sikh wars in the 1840s, and they were both very, very hard battles. And part of the reason they were very hard is that the British brigades in those days were generally 2 Indian units and 1 British unit in a brigade. So you'd have like 3 battalions of infantry. 2 of them would be Indian sepoys and 1 would be British soldiers. And the Indian sepoys didn't like fighting the Sikhs. They were quite scared of them. And so they often hung back. So you'd often get 1 British battalion going over entrenchment to like face the Sikhs at bayonet point, and the 2 Indian battalions would hold back. So they were really hard-fought battles. And so Harry Smith ended up fighting a battle at Aliwal. He had about 12,000 troops, and no, actually, I think it was less than that. I think it was about 8,000. But he was facing a much bigger Sikh force, and he used his infantry, artillery, and cavalry perfectly. Aliwal's often called the battle without a mistake because it was such a perfect victory. And the 12th Lancers who were the only British light cavalry unit to wear red coats. All the rest of the British light cavalry used to wear blue coats, except for the 12 Lancers. And the 12 Lancers ended up breaking 2 Sikh infantry squares, which was something very, very difficult for cavalry to do. And so that was Harry Smith. And he was just too old. When the Crimean War started in 1854, his name was talked about as the British commander. And had he been the British commander, I don't think we would have got nonsense like the charge of the Light Brigade, for example. But sadly, he was a bit too old for that. But yeah, Harry Smith, another great Brit as far as I'm concerned. You got any soldiers you're particularly fond of, Adam?
He fought for the wrong side, but I quite liked Thomas Fairfax.
Mm-hmm.
You know, who led the Roundheads. Yeah, I always seemed pretty good. I know he did lose some pretty big battles quite severely at times, but he did also have quite a lot of successes as well.
Yeah, definitely.
One who was a bit more modern as well. I quite liked the guy who was in charge of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force in 1918. Allenby, Edmund Allenby.
Yeah, he was good. He started off as the British Cavalry Division commander in 1914.
Yeah. He was quite good on the old logistics stuff. Like he could really take a force and sort of make it very efficient and sort of increase their odds that way quite effectively.
Yeah, the whole lions led by donkeys thing from World War One just isn't really true. Yeah, they were dumb British generals, but I mean, there were actually good British generals too. And more British generals were killed in World War One than in World War Two. So, they weren't all sitting back in chateaus taking no notice of the troops at the front, which is kind of
I sometimes think it was kind of to their detriment though, because there was a big tradition in the old officers class of sometimes taking a few too many risks, not ducking too much, not taking too much cover, always trying to be stoic. But it was, especially when we kind of moved into a more modern form of warfare, they were really putting themselves at risk a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Although, like, even when I joined the British Army in like the early 1980s, the good officers will always follow me. I mean, that's the only way to be a good officer is to say follow me. You can't send people to do stuff that you don't do yourself. So, I mean, I'm talking about junior officers. Obviously, generals probably shouldn't be in the front line, but they very often were in World War One. And there were some excellent British generals in World War One who basically get ignored these days.
Yeah.
Another guy who's worth mentioning is Field Marshal Sir William Robertson. Field Marshal Sir Willie Robertson, as everyone called him, was he joined the army as a private in the 1870s in a Lancer regiment. I can't remember which regiment it was now, but he joined a Lancer regiment as a trooper, and rose to be a field marshal. And he was the chief of the Imperial General Staff in 1914. So, and he apparently, to his dying day, he always dropped his ages.
Was this the guy? Was this the guy that was in the Boer War?
Yeah, he was in the Boer War. I think he was also in the campaigns in the Sudan as well. So yeah, absolutely. What Robertson was in the Boer War and in the Sudan as well. But I think he's still the only soldier who ever went all the way from private to field marshal of the British Army.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Another one I quite like is Thomas Picton.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me, I'm dying. Yeah, absolutely. Picton was one of the best of Wellington's commanders. And they used to have in the National Army Museum in London, I don't know if they still got it because the museum's been buggered up these days by left-wing nonsense. They used to have his top hat with the bullet hole in it that he was wearing when he was killed at Waterloo. He was leading a counter-attack against the French at Waterloo and was shot in the head and killed. So But yeah, he was a good commander and a great Welshman, by the way.
Yeah.
I actually mentioned him on a stream the other day that AA was doing. In the chat, they were talking about great Welshmen, and they said they couldn't find that many great Welshmen. And he was a soldier who immediately came to my mind. So yeah, Thomas Picton for sure. Apparently, some people want to take his statues down in Wales. Like there's a big statue of him in Brecon, for example. So I don't know why. Presumably he did something that's not PC 200 years ago, you know. So
Yeah, I went into a pub in Wales last year called the Picton. Might have been named after him.
Yeah, I'm sure it would have been. He absolutely would have been, I'm sure. He was very famous in his day, and he was one of the few generals who Wellington trusted. Like Wellington had 2 or 3 generals who he trusted, and he would let operate a little bit independently. And Picton was one of those people who Wellington considered knew his business, and so could be trusted to lead an attack or what have you. So yeah, Picton definitely another good British commander. You've also got to look at Field Marshal Roberts in the 19th century. Like he was Rudyard Kipling's Bobs, who led successful campaigns in Afghanistan, of all places. Much more successful than our most recent outings in Afghanistan, at least. So there's that. And his great rival at the time, of course, was Sir Garnet Wolseley. And he's the bloke who, you know, the Gilbert and Sullivan opera with the modern Major General song. I am the very model of a modern Major General. That was actually, they were referring to Sir Garnet Wolseley in that. And Wolseley, he did campaigns in Canada against some rebels. He did the Ashanti War in West Africa, which was an awful colonial expedition that destroyed the Ashanti Empire, which was a slaving empire that also killed like thousands and thousands and thousands of Black Africans. Like there were roads in the Ashanti capital that were lined with human skulls. And the vile British imperialists got rid of those guys. And he did that. And then he was in charge of the Gordon Relief Expedition and arrived too late. But that was mainly because Gladstone sent him too late. So didn't arrive in time to save Gordon in Khartoum. So yeah, those 2 guys. I mean, there's General Gordon himself, who of course is another bloke who's been traduced over the years. You know, people have claimed he was gay and all sorts of other stuff with no evidence whatsoever. You know, there's no evidence he ever did anything homosexual in his life. And actually, he was a very strong Christian. And he also, one of the things he used to do, and of course people have used this against him, is he would get like boys who were orphans and homeless and stuff, and he would get them jobs. Like he'd get them jobs in the Merchant Navy and stuff like that. And he had a map in his house where he had little flags where all these guys had gone all around the world and stuff like this. And he'd keep, like, because they'd write him letters and things. And of course, people try to say, oh, yeah, well, obviously he was gay, but he was a pedophile and all this. So there's no evidence for any of that, whatever. I mean, he used to get on trains, Gordon this is, and chuck bloody Christian tracts out the window and hope people would find them and stuff like that, you know. So another guy, there's actually a really good documentary that you can find on YouTube about Gordon of Khartoum. I think it's called Charlie Gordon or something like that. There's a good movie called Khartoum where, what's his name? American actor, tall guy. It's actually probably his best film, to be honest, in my opinion. But he plays Gordon, and the only thing that's wrong about him is that Gordon was a little guy. He was about 5'6", 5'7", and Gordon first became famous in China. The most destructive war in terms of human life there's ever been before World War II was the Taiping Rebellion in China, and Gordon was put in charge of an army called the Ever Victorious Army. And it wasn't ever victorious when he took it over. It was like run by like I think the guy he took over from was a very drunken American officer. And Gordon took over, and he never carried anything except a swagger cane. Never carried a revolver or a rifle or anything, or even a sword. And he turned this so-called ever victorious army into an actually ever victorious army. It was all Chinese soldiers, and helped defeat the Taiping rebellion. And that's why people called him Chinese Gordon, because that's how he first became famous. And Wolseley, who knew Gordon, said Wolseley said that Wolseley was not fit to polish Gordon's boots as a man. So he was very upset when he arrived too late to save him in the cartoon. So yeah, those guys too. You got any others, Alan?
No, some of the names are kind of slipping me now.
I mean, if you're going to talk about admirals and captains and so on, you could go on forever. I mean, obviously there's Nelson, of course, who I would put as probably one of the greatest Englishmen ever. You've also got to look at another guy, Scottish guy, Thomas Cochrane, who was an extraordinary, he eventually became an admiral, but an extraordinary captain in the Napoleonic Wars. Did some really amazing things, like he captured a big Spanish frigate with a tiny little brig with little 6-pounder pop guns. He also went on to command some of the South American navies when they were breaking free from Spain, and repeatedly defeated guys. Unfortunately for him, he was involved in a financial scandal, which may or may not have been true. It was during the Napoleonic Wars, and it would have made him quite a lot of money. And he may or may not have been involved in that. But so for a while, he was sort of persona non grata to the Brits. And it was actually Queen Victoria, when he was quite old, who brought Cochrane back. And there's a photograph of Cochrane taken in the 1840s, I think, in his sort of Napoleonic admiral's uniform, which is quite interesting if you find it on Google or somewhere.
Yeah, I need to read way more about naval stuff. I picked up a book actually at someone's recommendation called "To Rule the Waves" by Arthur Herman, but I haven't gone through it yet.
Yeah, it's that's a pretty good book. I've read that. I got into naval stuff like donkeys years ago. If you read, there's a great series of historical novels by Patrick O'Brian, and have you seen the movie Master and Commander?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that movie is based on his Patrick O'Brian's historical novels. There's about 20 of them, I believe, and he's like a more intellectual hornblower, if you like. His books are more literary than C.S. Forester's books, but they're brilliant. And actually, a lot of the actions in that are based on Thomas Cochrane stuff. A lot of the stuff that Jack Aubrey, the hero of the books, does is actually based on Cochrane's actions in the Napoleonic Wars.
Mm. Yeah, they need to make a sequel to that film.
Yeah,
I'd
love
one of the
them
only modern films I actually like.
Yeah, no, I'd love them too. Actually, bloody the star of it, the Aussie guy, said he would be happy to make a sequel. Trouble was, it didn't make quite enough money at the time. It's one of those movies that has become more successful like years after it came out. But I think, absolutely, it's one of my top 3 films. I mean, along with Zulu and The Cruel Sea, which is another naval movie that I really love. Absolutely right. It's a great film, and it's the most accurate movie that's ever been made about sort of Nelson's navy. Ben Gale in the chat. As I said, the National Army Museum, along with the National Maritime Museum, have both been ruined by political correctness and stuff. They've changed them totally. They've dumbed them down from what they used to be. And as I say, political correctness and left-wing people running the bloody things have, in my opinion, more or less destroyed both the National Army Museum and the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich as well. So yeah, I've got no argument about that. Like they used to have there was a big case at the National Army Museum that was all about Bladensburg, and it even had like American Army colours that the British had captured in the case. And I don't think the last time I went there, I wasn't there for very long because I had other things to do. But I don't even remember seeing that last time I was there. So yeah. So yeah. I mean, look, there are really so many great sailors. I mean, you've got people like Cunningham in World War II. You've got people like Jesus, my mind is blanking on names today. You've got people like what was his name now? Jellicoe, who commanded the Grand Fleet in World War I, and had he had a better subordinate than Beatty, the German Grand Fleet would have got the German High Seas Fleet would have got crushed at the Battle of Jutland. The only reason it wasn't crushed at the Battle of Jutland was that Beatty was incompetent. But anyway, so yeah, loads and loads of great British sailors from all eras, really. I mean, you can even look at people like Mike Clapp in the Falklands War. He was in command of the amphibious forces in the Falklands War, and that amphibious landing at St. Carlos Water was kind of like the most important and the most risky part of the whole campaign.
Yeah.
Hang on, what am I looking at here? You would think. Oh, great. Yeah, Bengal. I can really see why the British Army, National Army Museum would have pro-IRA and anti-British posters in it. Not really, I can't, but there we go. Oh, dear. But the National Army Museum, like back in the day, it really only went up to 1914 because what they said was that, you know, if you want to see stuff after 1914, go to the Imperial War Museum. And the Imperial War Museum then used to like be World War One and World War II, but it also had most of the post-World War II stuff as well. So like I remember they had exhibits about fighting the Mau Mau in Kenya and stuff like that, you know, which I'm sure they would have got rid of these days.
Yeah, I think I went about 2 years ago, and it was almost they had some Cold War stuff, but it was almost all World War One and World War II exclusively.
Yeah, when I used to go to the Imperial War Museum, and I used to go quite a lot. I mean, I've probably been in the Imperial War Museum like 50, 60 times. It didn't have huge amounts of other stuff, but I distinctly remember it had a section on the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, including some homemade firearms that the British Army had captured and stuff like that. It had stuff about the campaign against the terrorists in Cyprus, and one or two other things. There was some post-World War II stuff there, I remember at one stage.
There was in the Imperial War Museum, there was a bit about them sort of tackling Oswald Mosley.
Really?
Yeah,
in the Imperial War Museum.
Yeah, they had a bit on spies. They had a big section on spies, and they had about how they'd like infiltrated and were keeping an eye on Oswald Mosley.
Well, I mean, it's like that traitorous, vile moron Tony Blair who turned around and said World War II was fought to save the Jewish people. It's absolute crap, you know. It was, you know, it may have saved the Jewish people in the end. Maybe, I'm not sure it did actually. I think it probably killed more of them than anything else. But yeah, it certainly wasn't fought for that reason at all. But I don't know. It's yeah, this kind of stuff. Yeah, I know, Sojourner, I do get more echo than I used to because I'm in a room that is about 5 times bigger and there's not much I can do about that. Unless I find a smaller room to stream from, which I really can't do at the moment because my internet's crap. But there we go. So, yeah, I think we should probably talk about some people who are not military types. So what about inventors and artists and writers and this kind of stuff? I mean, you've obviously William Shakespeare goes without saying, Dickens, in my opinion, Rudyard Kipling. Kipling's absolutely brilliant. Jesus, there's just so many.
Yeah, Kipling's good. One of the things I've never quite got on with him over is the way he sort of thinks about patriotism. Like he thinks that Britain is great because it's powerful. That's kind of the lens that he goes through.
Yeah.
And I think he openly says in one of his poems, he says like, if it wasn't, we'd chuck her or something like that. And I think, well, that's kind of just you, to be honest. But, you know.
I don't know. I wouldn't say that that's totally the lens that he goes through. I mean, you got to remember that, like, when Kipling was writing, Britain was kind of like the world superpower. So certainly in terms of naval stuff and in terms of the British Empire, which, you know, it was the biggest empire there's ever been. It was like a quarter of the earth and about a third of the world's population. So you can kind of understand where he's coming from that. And also, of course, he came from in inverted commas, an Indian family, which is to say a British family which like lived in India, and their kids were sent home when they were usually about 7 or 8 to do their schooling, and then they went back out to India again. So he was looking at things from that kind of through that kind of lens. But I don't think his patriotism was purely just because Britain was powerful. I think it was just the fact that Britain was powerful back then.
Yeah, possibly.
But I love Kipling stuff. I mean, like, even Indian nationalists will tell you that Kim is a brilliant book because of how accurately it portrays India. And actually, I quite like Kim the movie, which was one of Errol Flynn's last films. And of course, everyone will slag that off now because Errol Flynn was playing an Indian guy in it. You know, you're supposedly not supposed to do that anymore for whatever reason. But yeah, so Kipling, I would definitely put up there as a great British guy. And of course, his son was killed in World War I, fighting with the Irish Guards, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. I mean, for painters, I'm not a big art guy myself, but I like Turner. No one else ever seems to like him, but I quite like Turner.
Yeah, I love Turner. I do. I really love Turner. The Fighting Temeraire and stuff like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm a big Turner fan. There's actually quite a good film about Turner, which I think is just called Turner. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's got that Brummy guy that's in a lot of stuff, who also played the last British hangman, and who was in Auf Wiedersehen Pet, if you remember that show.
No.
Yeah, he's a Birmingham guy. I can't remember his name, but yeah, he plays Turner, and it's not a bad film. So yeah, Turner, I'd definitely say was one up there. I also like some of the more classic Victorian painters like Alma Tadmar and people like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I quite liked that woman. Is it Elizabeth Butler?
Mm-hmm. Yep. She's the one who does the military paintings.
Yeah, did she do it was the famous Zulu painting, wasn't it?
She did the one that was done for Queen Victoria, yeah.
Yeah, and she also did one of the graveyard of empires painting of the Afghanistan campaign. Yeah.
And also the other famous one, a very famous one that she did was the Scots Greys charging at Waterloo.
Yeah.
So there we go. Another British soldier we should mention is Sergeant Hewitt of the Scots Greys, second Brits, who captured a French eagle at Waterloo, and he wrote this really graphic account. Apparently, Sergeant Hewitt was a huge, very strong guy, and he wrote this graphic account of like chopping Frenchmen's heads in half from the top and this sort of stuff with his sword to get this French eagle away. And like in one case, I think I'm trying to remember that. One case, he hits this Frenchman in the mouth and talks about his teeth shattering as the blade hits his mouth. It's really graphic. But Hewitt managed to capture this eagle, and he was commissioned for that because he was a sergeant, and they made him an officer. And just below Edinburgh Castle, I think there's a pub called the Sergeant Hewitt, which is named after it. But yeah, I think I can't remember where I read the account now. I think it's in one of the regimental histories of the Scots Greys, but it's worth reading. But yeah, Elizabeth Lady Butler is certainly a good British artist from the 19th century. She also did the roll call, which is the guards on the day after the Battle of Inkerman, lining up for those guys who hadn't been killed or wounded at the Battle of Inkerman, where like vast numbers of Russians attacked a much smaller British force and were defeated. And that's another one of her famous paintings. And she was actually married to a British Army general who was an Irishman, an Irish Catholic guy. And that's one of the reasons her paintings are so accurate, is because her husband was a general. She was able to get like guys to actually charge her from the Scots Greys so that she could see what it looked like to do her painting. And when she did the Rorke's Drift painting, like a lot of the soldiers who were actually in England at the time went and posed for her, so she got really accurate pictures of the guys who fought at Rorke's Drift and this kind of stuff. One of the advantages of being married to a general, you know, if you're going to do military paintings. So yeah, she was good. I liked her stuff. You also got to look at some of our inventors. So you got obvious inventors and engineers, I suppose you should say. So you got obviously people like Stevenson, people like Brunel. I don't know, people. Brunel, I took my little boy when he was very, very small. I said my little boy, he's in his 20s now, but when he was very, very small, I took him to the SS Great Britain in Bristol. And he said, "It's a pirate ship, Daddy, it's a pirate ship." he was like 4, you know, so but I often wonder if there's got anything to do with the fact he's now serving in the Royal Navy. But anyway, so I took him on a ship when he was that age. But I used to take him sailing on boats a lot, actually. But yeah. So Isambard Kingdom Brunel, definitely a great British guy.
I quite like. I mean, this is more of a personal thing, but I quite like John Starley. He's kind of considered the guy to originally sort of invent the bicycle, or what we would now consider a bicycle.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that. Is that anything to do with, what was it called? A bloody hobby horse or something like that? I know there was a bike that had no pedals.
Yeah, no, this was the first bicycle that had a proper sort of pedal system like what we would have today. I think he started Rover.
Oh, okay, cool.
And obviously you got Isaac Newton as well. Because I'm sort of a budding mathematician, so I sort of look up to him, even though he was a bit of a social autist. But
yeah. Obviously Christopher Wren.
Yeah.
You've got to look at Christopher Wren. I mean, look, there's just you could do a 24-hour stream talking about great British guys, and you would still only get through probably a quarter of the more famous ones. You know, it's like there's just so many.
Yeah.
For a relatively small island, just so many great Brits. You know. McAdam is a Scotsman who's pretty famous, you know, with Tar McAdam roads and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You really people like Frank Whittle, who was I won't say he was the inventor of the jet engine, but certainly one of the inventors of the jet engine, because the Germans were also working on jet engines at pretty much the same sort of time. But Frank Whittle was certainly one of the guys who was doing that stuff. There are just so many, and we don't talk about these people anymore, because you're supposed to be ashamed of Britain these days, and like all the great people that we've produced, like map makers, cartographers, poets, bloody Michael Faraday, as someone has mentioned in the chat there. Yeah, there's just so many, and kids go through their whole schooling and don't get taught about most of these people.
Yeah, it is actually really quite shocking. I think someone made a point the other day where they said that like, since the state has gotten involved in education, for better or worse, I mean, a lot of people probably say it's not a bad thing, and it probably isn't. But since it's happened, you've just seen a massive decline in the quality of education, even though kids are at school for longer and longer.
Yeah, I don't know. Look, my view of state education is that it used to be okay, and it's just got worse and worse and worse as time's gone on, like most things in the Western world. Like when I was at school, I was still taught some stuff about the British Empire and what have you. Not a lot, but some. Most of it I read myself, but now apparently it's you do some social history of the Middle Ages, and then it's all about the bloody Nazis, so.
Yeah.
Thomas Carlyle, good one. Absolutely, Thomas Carlyle. James Cook, absolutely James Cook. And he's another guy came from quite humble beginnings.
Yeah, didn't he start out on coal barges?
He started out on coal ships, yeah.
Right,
that
yeah.
used to sell coal down to London. Yes, he did. And he started off as a pretty ordinary sailor. And he made his name when Britain was capturing Canada from the French for doing surveys in the rivers there on boats under fire quite often from the French. And they would survey how deep different places were so that they knew where they could move ships and boats and so on. And that's how he first made his name. And then, of course, he did his great exploratory voyages, which we're not supposed to talk about anymore, because for some reason, the fact that some Aboriginals lived in like bark huts meant that because Cook arrived, he hadn't discovered anything because these Aboriginals were living in bark huts somewhere. So, I don't know. Thomas Carlyle, another great one. William the Marshal, yes, great Middle Ages knight. Yes, absolutely true.
Have you seen? I don't know how you feel about him, but have you seen Settlers' Laments stream he did the other night on Thomas Carlyle?
Yes, I did. I watched that. Yeah,
I thought that was quite good, to be honest.
Yeah, the only stream of Settlers' Lament that I really didn't like was the one he did on atheists, because he didn't have anyone there to balance out the talk. Like, I'm an atheist, but I'm not a militant atheist. I'm certainly no sort of atheism plus communist or anything like that. I'm an atheist because I just don't believe for myself, but that doesn't mean to say that I'm right. I mean, it could well be that Christians are right and I'm wrong. I really don't know. I mean, maybe I'm an agnostic. I don't know. I don't think I am, actually, because I don't believe for myself, but I certainly don't push it on anyone else. And I'm perfectly happy to admit that religion is a good thing for 99.9% of people. So, but yeah, I didn't like that stream that he did. I thought he needed a bit more balance on there. But generally speaking, I do follow Settlers' Lament. I'm actually on his Discord, I believe.
Yeah.
I would like to get Settlers' Lament on one of my streams one day, because, as you know, and I want to get like more Commonwealth people on my streams. I'd like to get more Australians and Canadians and New Zealanders on the stream. When I say Commonwealth, I'm talking about the old Commonwealth, which is to say Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and back in the day, South Africa. The rest of the Commonwealth, I think, is meaningless nonsense, but the actual British descent bits, I think, are quite important. Jeremy Clarkson, yeah, I'm not sure I'd say he was a great British person, but I don't mind Jeremy Clarkson.
Well, George Orwell.
Yeah, George Orwell. Yeah,
I used to be quite harsh towards him. I read his homage to Catalonia and of course all the other basics, and I was kind of a bit like, ooh, you know, I kind of feel that this guy's takes are a bit cold.
Bit left wing, yeah.
And he was a bit like, because of course he was a socialist, so he was very biased towards the socialists in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, a lot of his stuff about like the inner party and the outer party and stuff like that is just very correct. So I can't really hate on him too much.
Yeah. Did you see that movie that came out last year about the Holodomor in Russia?
No.
I can't remember what it's called. It's named after a person. It's Mr. something or other. And the guy who ends up writing about it is George Orwell. So yeah, Bolero, George Washington until 1775 or so. Yeah, absolutely right. There are letters from George Washington around now where he describes himself as an Englishman. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you got A.E. Houseman as well. I actually found him through that Peter Hitchens clip where he recites Shropshire Lad on Question Time, and after that, cool. I just really love that guy's stuff.
Yeah, I mean Roger Scruton. I think he's another guy who you could probably consider to be a great British guy. The late Roger Scruton, I should say, because he died last year, of course. Listen, we like I said, we could do a 24-hour stream, and we still would only do probably about 10% of the better-known ones, really. And one of the things I liked is that you brought in a guy who, like, most people have never heard of, and there are so many people like that.
Yeah.
I mean, just so many. I mean, one guy I'll mention just briefly is Lieutenant Colonel Frank Bourne. Now, Frank Bourne was the bloody colour sergeant at Rorke's Drift in the Anglo-Zulu War. And unlike the guy who played him in the movie, who played a very good role and a very good character, the real Frank Bourne was actually very young. He was so young that the soldiers called him the Kid. And he was quite well educated. And he used to write letters home for one or two of the soldiers who didn't write so well. But he was very young to be a colour sergeant, and bear in mind the British Army in those days, a colour sergeant was kind of like a company sergeant major today, because there were no such thing as company sergeant majors back then. So if you were the colour sergeant, you were the top NCO of your company. And Frank Bourne was actually offered a commission after Rorke's Drift, and he turned it down because he didn't think he could afford it, because basically to be a British Army officer in those days, you actually to live on your pay was very difficult. Like, your pay wasn't enough, really.
Yeah.
And he turned it down, but he was such a damn good soldier that about 10 years later, he was offered another commission, even though he turned one down before, and he took it this time. And he finished up a lieutenant colonel. And he didn't die until 1944. In fact, after the D-Day landings, he saw the D-Day landings. He was the last British survivor of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. And another extraordinary soldier. And yes, Bolero 393, I would absolutely agree with Jonathan Bowden. I think Jonathan Bowden is an extraordinary British guy, and I wish we had someone like him around now. It was a great pity that he died so young. I don't know, what do you think about Bowden, Emma?
Yeah, I like Bowden a lot. He's pretty good. Didn't Frank Bourne die on VE Day?
He might have done, actually, mate. I'm not sure. I know it was after the D-Day landings. I don't think it was VE Day. I think he died in 1944. But you might be right. You could be right. I'm not gonna stake my life on that.
Either way, it does kind of say it does kind of show how close like Rorke's Drift and the sort of peak era of the empire was to today.
Oh yeah, absolutely. People don't understand that at all. I mean, like I was born in 1965, and when I was born, there were still quite a lot of guys alive who had fought in the Anglo-Boer War, like quite a lot.
Yeah.
I think it was only in the 1970s that the Anglo-Boer War Veterans Society was wound up. So yeah, people don't realise how close some of this stuff was. Like one of the things I always tell people to do in terms of history is to look at something now in terms of the time, like 10, 20 years ago or 50 years ago, and then like go backwards from that, and you can see how close things were. So like I was born 20 years after the end of World War II. But we are now, where are we? 82. We're like nearly 40 years from the Falklands War now. So, people, that was much further away from me now. And I remember the Falklands War like it was yesterday. Like I went to Portsmouth when when HMS Hermes came home. And the whole place was just a sea of Union flags and white ensigns and cheering people. And it was probably I reckon I was probably prouder to be a British guy that day than I've ever been in my life. It was so cool, man. It was just so cool to be British on that day, like as the fleet was coming home victorious. It was great stuff. Brilliant stuff. But yeah, it's a long way back in history these days. And the last 40 years have been far worse than the 4 years before that, which were worse than the 4 years before that. So, I mean, Simon Parkes, I'm not sure. Maybe. Richard de Lionheart, yeah, I'm not sure if I would say Richard de Lionheart was really British, to be honest with you, but yeah, I suppose. Well, I suppose. So anyway, Adam, we're probably going to wrap this up pretty much. You got any final bits or anything?
No, I'm all good.
All right, guys. As I said, this was partly to test my internet out. Thank you for the suggestions in the chat. I will be back, I hope, on Saturday evening with Brutus and whoever is doing a stream. Brutus is going to be doing that because I'm very short streaming time at the moment. But after that, I hope that my own Splendid Isolation streams will come back as a regular thing on Saturday evenings. So thanks for joining us. Thank you, Adam, for joining us. And have a good day, ladies and gents.